General Manager Brandon Beane and new coach Joe Brady met with the media yesterday at the Combine. Wanted to jump on and talk to you guys about a few things from those press conferences and maybe what they were trying to say. Let's talk some Bills. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Bud Talks Bills. I am your host, Bud. So Joe Brady and Brandon Beane met with the media yesterday at the Combine. And I think that there was some things discussed, that are a little relevant to the last episode when I went over maybe a difference in drafting philosophy and what they're looking for at the Combine, if there was going to be a different process in trying to find the right player to draft and when. I think that we did get a good indication that that Brandon Beane is still really running this show. A lot of the messaging was the same, trying to drive home, both Brandon Beane and Coach Brady, driving home that they want to get in front of as many prospects as possible, getting to know the player off the field. I think that that's something that they obviously value a great deal in this process. In contrast to something that I discussed in the last episode, which was kind of this new movement that some teams are taking, including, I know probably the most notable team is Jacksonville with Liam Cohen, is they're not sending the head coach and the general manager to the Combine because they don't want to draft off of feel. Kind of just what the player puts on tape, height, weight, measurables, 40 time and that kind of thing is what they want to base, their draft process around. I'm not sure that I feel like that is exactly what I would do. But I was interested to see if there was going to be a shift in, how the Bills organization handled this Combine with the new coaching staff. Them driving that point home that they want to get to know these players face to face, as many exposures, I think is the term that, Brandon Beane used, as many prospects, as many times as they can, really getting to know them. I think that might speak to that this really is, the Brandon Beane show. And that was his philosophy before. I know that one of the key words that we heard throughout the opening press conference with Joe Brady, and I think we heard it 20 times, and in that hour, was the word alignment. Maybe Joe Brady, just feels, the same way. Maybe they are aligned in that, or maybe, Joe Brady kind of had the inside scoop, before that interview and how Brandon Beane, likes to operate and kind of knew what to say, had, a bit of a, the cheat sheet before that interview. Conversation for a different day, kind of not where I'm trying to go with this, but I think the point that I'm trying, to get to is I also discussed on that last podcast about, the draft rut that Brandon Beane has clearly been in lately. And that was, referring to, Joe Marino's Locked On podcast about kind of comparing quality starters on their rookie deals across the league. And I believe Buffalo is 23rd in that list, according to Joe Marino, on kind of like a point scale that he had gone over. And that's compared to the rest of the league. Brandon Beane's been in a draft rut in conference, comparing to the teams in our conference, in our division, but also comparing, to some of the previous drafts that that Brandon Beane has had, getting some just quality starters up and down the draft. Using that same draft process and thought process of getting these guys, face to face and getting to know the person, has almost bit them lately. Two of the main examples you can think of is, the key on, a lot was made of that draft interview and, the personality, and they kind of fell in love with the person. it is also ironic to me and a little, I don't want to say concerning, but kind of has me pausing a little bit, is the fact that in the same press conference that Brandon Bean talked about wanting to get to know the person off the field and getting a good gauge on that, he also has to reference the fact that they like what Keon Coleman has done in the offseason work wise on the field. It's the off field maturity, that might be holding him back. Um, Feels like something that might have been picked up in one of these interviews if they hadn't fallen in love with the person. Another example, not even on the team anymore, is Kyrie Elam. A lot was made of the notebook draft interview. He walks in, has this notebook, and Bean and I think McDermott fell in love with it, and here we are trading up for Kyrie Elam, and he's not even on the team 3 years later. We trade him for a fifth or a sixth round pick. Um, it is it is a little concerning. I don't like using that word. Trying to keep with the internal optimism, that I want to press forward. Um, and I'm not saying that I think that this complete extreme, not even going and getting to know the player at all, that Jacksonville and some other teams seem to be doing. I don't think that that's the right. That's not what I would do, at least. But I do find it interesting that even the biggest Brandon Bean supporters and truthers would have to admit there has been a draft rut, and we're just going kind of, it sounds like, status quo, going there, getting to know these guys. Um, and that's just one side of it. That's just the interview part. We don't know if there will be, a change in archetype that they look for at certain positions. I went over that in the last episode as well. Are we looking to get some of these guys, value, let them fall, hope the 40 time is a little slower, or, is Brady and the rest of this coaching staff that's there, are they going to push for, um, get me the best football player? I want the guy with the fastest 3-cone shuttle and, the fastest 40 time, and just these guys that test off the chart, which just seems that, we have gotten on the defensive side of the ball, in the past. It'll, we still have to kind of figure that out, and we don't know. We'll probably find out a little bit more about that on draft night. I thought that was interesting, that connection of, you know, man, we want to get in front of these guys. We want to learn who they are as a person, what makes them tick, if they love ball, if they're going to be motivated beyond money. These are all things that, we've kind of heard over the last couple of years in the middle of a draft rut from Brandon Bean, and we're kind of hearing the same messaging even with the new coaching staff coming in. Just something, to keep an eye on. Another thing that I think kind of caught my attention, I'm sure it caught other people's attention too, is how glowingly Joe Brady talked about Khalil Shakir. He's one of our best football players, and the belief that he can win at all three levels on the football field, the short, the intermediate, and even, in the deep passing game. It's one of those things where Joe Brady was in charge of the offense last year. He was calling plays and kind of scheming things up. Maybe there was something more to these Khalil Shakir injuries, or maybe there was something at the beginning of the year, and Khalil Shakir just, they were struggling to kind of find a spot for him. Maybe it had nothing to do with Shakir, and maybe it was just the fact that Palmer was out and Keon Coleman was completely unreliable, and Dalton Kincaid was injured. I know it's a different position group, but you had these guys that were out. Maybe it was just kind of like this duct tape it together and try to keep it together and do what we can, with Khalil Shakir, trying to fill some of these other roles. Maybe if we get a more, explosive X or reliable, X that, we kind of are hoping that Keon Coleman was going to be and potentially still could be. Maybe if Dalton Kincaid's on the field a little bit more, a little more reliable, with the injuries, maybe we see an expanded role for Shakir. It's something that I would be excited to see. Shakir, I think, is very underrated, in terms of intermediate routes. I think he can run a 10-yard dig and catch the ball over the middle. I think that, he's obviously good after the catch, but it doesn't just have to be bubble screens and smoke screens and those kind of routes. You can get him upfield, let him get open. Um, I I was excited to hear Joe Brady talk about that. It was also um, just a little ironic that he was calling the offense and Shakir was kind of targeted behind the line of scrimmage, if not more than everybody in the league. Just he was right there at the top. Um, I thought that that was good to hear. Another thing that was kind of brought up was potential, and this was Brandon Beane was a potential move for Taron Johnson to safety. Um, I'm not a film expert. I don't break things down. I will always admit that. Taron Johnson doesn't really feel like one of those, fits to go back for the safety role that we're kind of looking for. In the last episode, I discussed trying to pair, a kind of a deep, free ranging center field type safety with Cole Bishop as like a box robber type safety. Um, if anything, I feel like Taron Johnson would kind of fit more of that box safety role, even though he would be even more undersized, than his position probably calls for now. Um, I just feel like he's one of those guys that with age is kind of exposed it a little more. Not saying that his career's over by any stretch by his physical ability to play, but just kind of the older he's gotten, it feels like the farther away from the line of scrimmage he gets, the more isolated you make him, um, the less consistent he's been, these last couple of years. Not too excited about the thought of moving Taron Johnson to just full-time safety or letting him compete for that and maybe taking away from a role that he could still have in the nickel. It is a different defense, but there is still a need for, nickel backs in this league and in this defense that Jim Leonard will be bringing to us. Um, I'm not sure about that fit. Another little nugget that, maybe could have gone overlooked was the slight comment from Bean of we'll see what happens, where he kind of fits in after a couple weeks with Jim. Um, Anybody that follows Joe Marino, and Greg Tomset, the salary cap, the post June 1st, cut for Taron Johnson would be kind of more beneficial for the Bills. So maybe it's a thing where they get him in there. We're going to try him here, try him there, see if it's a fit, and maybe use that, post June 1st cut, money. The cap savings, I think, was around 8 million, is a post June 1st cut. That could be a potential. Yet you hate to think about moving on from somebody like Taron Johnson, what he's meant to this defense, the plays that he's made, the moments he's been a part of. But I think that I, like a lot of Bills fans, have kind of gotten past the sentimental part with a lot of this. We moved on from Jordan Poyer and had to watch him play with the Miami Dolphins for a year, and we had to let Micah Hyde go, and Mitch Morse was playing with Jacksonville for a year. If Jim Leonard comes in and determines that Taron Johnson is just not a fit for this defense or not a piece that he can kind of move around and use with the value of Taron Johnson's contract, I think that it is something to strongly be considered as one of those post June 1st cuts. Um, those are really the main takeaways that I took from those press conferences. The other thing that a lot of people have kind of been discussing lately is the finger pointing towards McDermott. Even at the press conference with Pagula and Brandon Beane at the end of the year, right after we had fired McDermott, there's just been a few comments here and there. When Brandon Beane used the word refreshing, talking about discussing players with Jim Leonard and Fitz and saying, I just want good football players and we'll make it work with, the good football player, and even using, a scale kind of, with his hands of, if he's a scheme fit and they're equal, we'll take the scheme fit. But if there's a player that's just, exceedingly better than another player that might be a fit for our scheme, we want the better player. Um, Combine that with you know, the trying to emphasize the multiplicity of this defense. And yes, there is going to be a scheme change, but it's not necessarily just a 3-4 or a 5-man front, or, there could be some 4-man fronts. And in the talk about wanting to be able to just put our best 11 defensive players out on the field, in match up to the defense and whatever they do, and just, be more multiple. Um, I think that there could be, that could be taken as a finger point at McDermott even now. The comments of it being refreshing and trying, to fit like he said, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's something that maybe Bills fans have felt was happening. And that can get into different, avenues of, was McDermott actually involved in personnel decisions and who we drafted in scheme fits, and what did he have a say in, in the board on draft day? There's a lot of comments and opinions on that. We'll never really know, but it just feels like there's an emphasis in trying to distance, the people that are still there, Bean and even Brady to an extent. It feels like they're trying to distance themselves from McDermott. Um, there's been a lot of talk about there being a headbutting contest between Bean and McDermott, and that, the Bills fired the wrong guy. I'm not here, trying to say one way or the other right now. I'm just observing, what people are saying, and I've watched the defense, and I've watched how our drafts have gone, and trying to kind of, piece some of this puzzle together based on that. Maybe there was some headbutting between Bean and McDermott, and Bills fans were quick to run to McDermott's defense, me included. Um, but I think something that, just some optimism, and again, not trying to point fingers at McDermott with everybody, but, what if there was a headbutting between the two of them, and Brandon Bean's the guy that's right? That is still, a possibility here. And, maybe Brandon Bean was trying to get these, you know, better players, these better prospects, and these guys that test, to a level of, maybe somebody above a scheme fit. But man, we have to get that, player into our scheme, and we have to be able to fit that peg into that hole. Um, Time will tell. We will see how this draft goes. Kind of like the head coaching hire, like I said in the first episode, we're gonna have to wait about a year, to see, who was really right in that. And we won't know on draft day. We'll get a good indication based on, if we're drafting, similar archetype type players, or even if it's, just, man, he's kind of a worker, didn't really test off the charts, but he could fit this role, in a defense, instead of going and getting these guys that just test off the charts, that, Jim Leonard, or even Joe Brady on the offensive side, can really just use and figure out a way to have them impact the game. But drafts, you know, you can rarely give a grade after a draft immediately. You got to let it play out. Um, just wanted to share a few thoughts on how I thought those press conferences went, and maybe some things to think about. Was McDermott a part of the personnel, and that's why personnel decisions, and that's why Bean's trying to kind of distance himself from it and say, "Hey, I can't." We got to go get guys that are top end guys, these the better football players that maybe aren't a scheme fit. And that's why it's refreshing to hear from Jim Leonard, say that that's what he wants as well. Um, Either way, still exciting. I know a lot of the on-field stuff will start tomorrow. Hopefully we'll be able to get back together before the end of the weekend, and talk about some of the results with that. It has been good talking another night of Bills football. And with that, I'll leave it with Go Bills.